Thank you, listeners, for joining us for Elko Live today. I'm so pleased to have two guests in studio who are going to be talking about this investigative report into Elko County's 2024 primary election. Now, both these gentlemen are known in the community, and something else they share in common is that they are both PhDs, although in very different areas of study. But it brings me great pleasure to welcome Dr. Scott Gavorsky and Dr. Hank Thurston to the studio here today. Welcome, gentlemen. Thank you.
Thank you, Larry.
So we will start with Hank. And Hank, I want to give you a chance just to do a little introduction so people understand the background again, what you were hoping to achieve with this report. And then I know Scott is going to chime in because he was able to provide a little more insight, I think it's fair to say, into the research that you did. Hank?
Sure. So this report began when one of our county commissioners approached me and said, "Hey, I've heard these concerns from some of the public about this study that was done using ChatGPT that suggested that there was like a really high probability of fraud in our elections." But he wasn't really comfortable interpreting the AI and the chatbot and that. And I come from a very technical background with a lot of math and science. And so he asked me to take a look at it. Said, sure, I'll take a look at it. Didn't really expect it to turn into the project that it became. But the more I mentioned that I was looking at this, more and more people became really excited to see the results of it. So it really ended up becoming a full research project.
So we have the full research project. It is available to the public. It is 42 pages of research. This represents hours and hours of uncompensated work. It's important people understand this was not work that was commissioned. And so for the purpose of this half-hour broadcast, we will narrow the scope of what we're talking about. Obviously, Hank, the big question is, was there fraud present in any of the Elko County 2024 primary races?
So the bottom line up front, based on every race that we looked at in the primary, there was no statistically significant indications of fraud found.
And it's important that we expand just a bit on what limited statistical precision is, right? Because there's always some probability that could sneak in there.
Right. And anytime we're looking at mass behaviors like voting, it is a statistical process. And anytime you're dealing with statistics, there's always some error bars. There's always a plus and minus. And of course, the larger your sample size, the more confident you are in your work. But when we're looking at something like Elko County, we're inherently limited in size based on population and based on number of precincts. The precinct is really the smallest unit that we can look at when we engage with the techniques that are used in this paper. And we have 41 precincts, and while that is a statistically significant sample, it's very much on the small side of that. So our error bars are a little bit wider than had they been 500 precincts.
And in the interest of time, we won't get deeply into the critique of the Operation Sunlight study, but I did want... sometimes I feel like I should call you Dr. Thurston because you earned that. But Hank, I should let you explain that we're not going to really critique the Operation Sunlight study, but we do want to mention it did inspire the concerns of potential fraud, and it was analyzed in your research.
That's correct. So this Operation Sunlight study came out. It was published on their blog in July of last year, so about a month after the primary. And essentially, the process that was done is the author provided the election data. Now, this was done initially, and what was reported on their blog was with Washoe County data. Something similar was later done for Elko County's data. But he provided this data to ChatGPT and basically told the chatbot to emulate a forensics mathematician and analyze this data and see if he found fraud. The results that the author reported was that, yes, there is something on the order of 99.9% sure that these elections were fraudulent. However, the transcript of that entire ChatGPT conversation is linked on the author's blog, and if you go through and read it, that's actually not what the machine's reporting. The machine is creating hypothetical data to model how you would go about solving this problem rather than actually analyzing the data and providing an answer to the author's original question. So that conclusion is based on hypothetical data that the machine made up as an example rather than the actual election data. So that's a big difference in meaning there.
Hank, thank you. It illustrates a couple of really important points. Again, maybe some fodder for future programs, but with the significance of Chat GPT, AI, we still need human beings to do these analysis. And I mentioned that this research represents hours and hours of work. Any idea maybe how much time you spent, again, as a human being, not as a computer?
Yeah, and that's important, the distinction you make about having human beings look at this, because the method that the chatbot suggested was an application of the binomial distribution to this problem, which is a good first pass for like maybe a 100 level stat student, but it misses several requirements that are required for that application. So it really is the wrong application to the problem. And we addressed that in the paper. But in terms of hours that I spent, I didn't really track it. I don't know. I know that I, like fingers to keyboard, wrote the interim report between the hours of about 4 o'clock in the afternoon and about 8 o'clock in the morning on August 6th. So beyond that, though, I'm not really sure.
Hank Thurston is one of our two guests today as we're talking about, again, this analysis into the Elko County 2024 primary election. You can find this final report. I'm assuming it's online somewhere, Hank? Or just by contacting you?
It's not. Yeah, you can contact me. I'll be happy to distribute it. The county commission has a copy of it. The county clerk has a copy of it.
Okay. And now we're going to segue over to Dr. Scott Gavorsky. And Scott, in this part of our conversation, you get to talk about what we get to do with this kind of research and some of the exciting findings that you found that actually made you want to reach out to Hank and say, hey, what do you think about my ideas on this, right, Scott?
Yeah, so part of how I got involved is when Hank started dealing with it. I'd been at the county commission meetings when this was brought up, but Hank needed the breakdown by precinct, which we took all the data from the canvas of the votes, right, so public records, by precinct. So I already had that divided up for a spreadsheet for some of my own research on demographics. Sent it over to Hank, and when he did the analysis, one of the things that showed up is there's no evidence of this statistically evident fraud, right? But one of the things is that something seemed to change in voting patterns in 2016 in Elko County. It became, within the model, harder to predict turnout at precincts, right? And of course, since 2016, we've had 3 major Nevada election changes, right? The introduction of the Dominion voting machines in 2018, introduction of automatic voter registration at the DMV in 2020, and then universal mail ballots after 2020. So the question was, okay, are these shifts related to that? Which of course wouldn't be fraud, but it could be an example of how election laws changed it. So what we did was sort of break down, well, when Hank presented that, my first thought is this is a demographic problem. Right, we've got a demographic change. So we broke the Elko precincts into 4 parts, and what we've really discovered is the change is really isolated in the 14 Elko precincts and the 12 Spring Creek precincts. And what's happened is that the Elko precinct voters are voting less than their share of the registered voter pool. The Spring Creek voters are voting at higher levels compared to their share of the registered voter pool. And that started in 2016 before all these changes. So one of the lessons we actually learned from this is the fact that voting patterns are changing in Elko County, right? And it's not fraud. It's not changes of these laws. It seems to be a change in the voting population itself.
So if I were to chime in, again, as an observer in the community, and that's really largely how I see my job, is trying to moderate these conversations, is that anecdotally, there might have been some motivation in Spring Creek. Spring Creek residents want better roads. Mm-hmm. They feel maybe that their needs or concerns weren't being represented, Scott. I mean, they're deciding a lot of important issues for themselves in the future.
Yeah, I think that's a large part of it, is that because most of them are in the county, if they're not in the Spring Creek Association, there is that absence of representation. I do think it's interesting, though, in and of itself, that you also have to explain the other side of that is why the Elko voters are voting.
Exactly.
And I think a lot of it actually has to do with age.
I wonder that.
Yeah, it's a big dynamic in historical voter turnout. And Elko, the city of Elko, particularly. We have a lot of homes that sort of function as starter homes for young families who then, as they get older and wealthier, move out into Spring Creek to buy the 5-acre, 10-acre, whatnot. And again, you correlate that with people who tend to vote more, and I think that part of it explains this change we've seen.
So thinking this through, as you were saying, sometimes this kind of research, this kind of conversation, some of it's anecdotal. Obviously, what Dr. Thurston described is research. It's powerful and pure research. But what Scott and I are talking about is, in order to get more senior citizen voters voting, because, they are certainly entitled to do that and their opinions are important to us, wouldn't we try to address that by maybe setting up an election ballot boxes at the senior center, for example?
Well,
I don't mean to. I'm just saying.
Yeah, no. I think it's a good idea, and it's being done. But one of the things that is interesting that came out of this report is that those areas that have both traditionally voted by mail and areas where presumably vote by mail would be attractive are not the areas that people are voting by mail. So we've got 12 precincts that since the 90s have been mail-only precincts, right? The rural areas that don't have polling places. They're actually among some of our lowest in terms of mail ballot turnout. The Spring Creek precincts have also shrunk. So I'm inclined, and again, most people know I'm a historian. When I look at this, that I'm inclined to think that there is an active change in voter behavior, right? It's not just an age diagrammatic, but it's also a fact that I think over the last 8 years, there's been a greater distrust, shall we say, of remote voting techniques. And I think that's also explaining it. So they're not only voting more, but they're voting more traditionally in the sense of going to the polls. And we saw that this last election, right? The long lines and crowds that we hadn't seen before.
And that there's just so many thoughts, obviously, racing through, because if people want to vote in person, then as a community, as a state, as a country, we should be doing everything we can to encourage that, right, Scott? If that's a trend or a tradition.
Yeah, no, I think we should encourage it. It's just it gets into a lot, I think, policy discussions over. Well, we've got AB 306 currently in the legislature about expanding ballot box options. One of the things, and this is an open question that's far beyond this show, but one of the things I think that's turning out is what we're seeing with the universal mail ballot is it's capturing people who would have voted anyway. They're just choosing the easier option and vote by mail. It doesn't seem to be bringing in new voters, which was part of the reason for changing it. So I think that's part of the dynamic that's probably going to have to be explored in the future.
As we are talking with Dr. Scott Gavorsky and, of course, Dr. Hank Thurston, they together collectively commenting on, after Hank Thurston wrote the report, the investigation into Elko County's 2024 primary election, which did not find any fraud present in the primary races, but now expanding on the conversation with this shifting voting impact of Elko and Spring Creek. So just reading here from 8.3, Elko and Spring Creek precincts are shifting their share of the total registered voter pool. They collectively represent 78% of all Elko County voters. Spring Creek precincts are becoming a bigger part of that share. And as we just talked about, Elko is decreasing. Mm-hmm. So with those mail-in, what you're finding or what you're extrapolating from this is that mail-in voting is not increasing people's motivation to vote.
Right.
The same number of people that always have will do that.
Well, that's what it appears to be. Now, I will point out just that section that you read is right, but that section was talking about registered voters. So that's a pure demographic change, right? People moving here or there.
Through the DMV too, or does it include that?
Any registered voters. So that's just the clerk's numbers. So you take the precincts and this percent share of all Elko County voters. The real change is going in, though, is that the Spring Creek voters, that pool of registered voters, is voting in a higher number than we see with the Elko voters, right? So both populations are increasing. It's just that there's a shift in that behavior, Right. Now, on the mail ballots, one of the things to also consider about mail ballots is we've had a couple changes to some of those mail-in precincts. So both Jackpot, which was mail-in precinct from 2008 up to just this last election, have started going back to in-person polling. And of course, Precinct 29, which is the Owyhee Reservation or the Nevada side, now has a polling place as well. And so that population has shifted to voting in person, where before they would have voted largely by mail.
And it is important to point out, Scott, that we are doing this, it's a hybrid. I mean, people can vote in person or mail in their ballots.
Right.
Yes.
Yeah.
So obviously, and as you said, there are conversations happening about how much emphasis we should place on one or the other in the future. There's going to be the continued conversation, and that's why this paper may come back, Hank, about using paper ballots, for example. Does that enhance, the confidence of people voting or hand counting these ballots? The use of Dominion machines was one of the primary concerns outlined in Operation Sunlight, right? Yeah.
I believe so, and that was echoed, I think, by some of the public that were present at the county commission meeting that this was prepared for. There was a strong push for paper ballots and hand counts.
So, Scott, did you want to talk about these changes in voting behavior? And I'm referencing 8.5. This is the one, the introduction of the automatic voter registration in January 2020. Some of us in the media, I did not research this on my own, but thought, wow, these nonpartisan numbers are coming up. That would signal a dissatisfaction with one party or the other. But that's not necessarily the truth.
No, and I think that's one of the big findings that's not just here. It's being reported widely across the state, is that this automatic voter registration, which is an opt-out system, so you have to tell the DMV you don't want to be registered to vote. One of the problems that's done is I think it's actually capturing a lot of people who don't have the inclination to vote for whatever reason. And again, age is a key factor, but it's not the only one. And I think that where that showed up in the examples I looked at was two sets of precincts here in Elko County. So we have Rendon, Precinct 32, where that share of registered voters and the share of those voters who vote, who cast ballots, pretty much parallels each other, even though it's grown. But if you look at West Wendover, where we've seen a sort of recent, particularly since 2020 and the automatic voter registration, a mass increase. The two precincts in West Wendover, 20 and 21, are the two of our three precincts that are majority nonpartisan. They also have the lowest voting totals in the county. So that mismatch, I think, is another factor that's influencing a lot of, I don't want to say poor, but it's complicating accurate policy judgments, I think, about some of the voting that's going on.
So being automatically registered to vote when you get your driver's license does not incentivize you to become an active voter.
Right. That seems to be what's happening. And of course, that share of the voters, when we looked at this in the primary, both Rendon and 20 and 21 West Wendover were about 4.5% of the registered voters in Elko County. So it's about a similar number. But of course, with the introduction of the VRAM system and the cleanup of the voter rolls that took place in August 2024, West Wendover's share dropped because there are people who might have been registered to vote in 2020 and now haven't voted in two consecutive federal elections. So they moved from that active to inactive category.
So, Scott, what do you envision? What might we do? We're learning something from this research, based on what Hank was able to come up with, obviously, with his statistics and the investigation. And what do you think? What do you hope to achieve? Where might we go now with this? I mean,
yeah, that's a big question, and I think I need to emphasize. Hank talked a little bit that we are really dealing with a small number of precincts, and it's a very unique environment that we have, even though we have. Probably far more variety in our political process than people would think from outside of Elko. But more importantly, as a historian, there's sort of an adage that it's worthwhile asking the same question over and over and over again, right? And looking at that data with that same question in mind, because over time, illuminating ideas will sort of continue. And I think that's one of the things we're seeing with this is despite the turmoil that we've had over the last 4 to 6 years. I think what we're finding is voting isn't really looking as different as it did 10 years ago, right? And a lot of changes that were supposedly being pushed in part to address voting aren't working if there are real problems, and there are in other cases not warranted because they're not really having an effect.
So I'll ask Hank the same question, Scott. What is the question that we might want to be asking over and over again, right? What comes to your mind, and then, Hank, what you might think?
Well, what comes to my mind is of course, you always need vigilance against election fraud. Fraud happens every election, even in this primary. Although we didn't find any systemic fraud, there was, in a report to the county commission, at least one case that was referred over of suspected fraud that was referred over to the district attorney. Now, what happened to that, I don't know. But, you need to make sure the elections are as clear and as transparent and as fair as possible. And if people have concerns, the best way to sort of calm the situation is actually address the concerns, not write it off, not say it's not important. This is why I think the commission was probably right in asking us to do this, and at least in my case, why I was interested in volunteering to help do this. Is this really gets us at the base of something, and what we found in this case is that there is a demographic change that probably is structuring some of the things we're seeing in Elko politics right now.
And so, Hank, we know that the best research is not a dead end, right? The best research should prompt even more questions. So I don't know, did you come up with, as a result of what you studied, do you have more questions that you think further research?
In this case, I don't think I do. I think this has satisfied the interested parties that the primary elections were free and fair. I hope that this kind of work in this election and maybe in future elections can go to maybe repair some of the trust in the system that I think has been lost over the past 5 or 6 years for a variety of reasons. And that's really why I wanted to attack this, because if there is fraud there, we need to know about it and we need to be able to address it. But if there's not fraud there, we need to know that so we can have confidence in our processes.
That's really important, fairness and trust. And, both the gentlemen that are in studio today happen to represent the Republican Party here in Elko County as well, in leadership. And Hank, you're the vice chair of the organization, right?
That's correct.
And you grew up here and obviously pursued your education, but you chose to move back to Elko to contribute to the community. Is it important to you that we have an engaged Democrat Party, for example? I used to talk to Lee Hoffman about this a lot, so I'm just curious as to how you feel about that. And can this research help that, for example?
I would certainly hope so. And I think the Democrat Party, the Republican Party, any of the third parties, any nonpartisan voters, I think we all want free and fair elections. I don't think any party's out there, even behind closed doors, saying, hey, we got to figure out how we can rig this. I don't think that's the case. And so in that sense, yeah, certainly I think the local Democrat Party or any other party would be interested in this and seeing the results of this and seeing that, yes, the elections that we're holding are as free and fair as we can make them. I think generally more voices in the room is better, as long as that can be held in a civil discord. And so to your question, yes, I think it is good to engage the other side of the aisle. And at the end of the day, we all have to live here. We all are living here. And it's a lot easier to figure out how to work together and how to get along towards those goals we do have in common, rather than try to dig in and fight over things that we don't need to fight over.
Thank you, Hank. Hank Thurston, of course, one of our guests today. He authored the initial investigation into Elko County's 2024 primary election, resulting in this 42-page research paper contributed to by Dr. Scott Gavorsky, who is mentioned as a historian by training. You have your own consulting business. And Scott also involved in the Elko County Republican Party. Did you want to comment on that as well? Because, again, having lived in Elko County myself almost 40 years, it would be so much better if we had a healthy balance, right? Healthy discourse, just people participating.
Yeah, and I think there really is a desire for that generally. We've been working on our side. Of course, back in 2023, we hosted sort of an open forum, a sort of legislative session wrap up that we invited the community to. We're going to do that again this year, I think. You recently did an interview with both Lee before he unfortunately passed away, and Lance Whitney, the chair of the Democratic Party. Very civil, very informative conversation. And that's what I think a lot of us want to hear much more of in politics. It's also more interesting. It helps us sort of get a perspective on what we're doing and, tweak what we might think about policies sometimes. Okay, maybe there is a better approach here. But at some point, also making sure people understand what we're feeling and what we're seeing going on.
It is easier to get people in the same room in your own community, and because these deep divides at the national level are certainly driven by the social media discourse, which is painful. It is, and it causes people to be fearful. We have people in the community right now who we understood didn't want to send their children to school in fear of being deported, things like that, or concerned about access to health care. And when we come together in the same room, it seems like some people of both parties have the same concerns. They don't want to see neighbors deported, for example, and they want to see people have access to health care, or education, right?
Yeah, and I think it's important to emphasize that being where we are in a rural community, stuff like access to health care is actually a shared concern, because the real tension there isn't really between political parties. It's an urban-rural divide where the two sides don't understand each other. So that's a whole nother conversation that needs to happen.
So, Hank, I just wanted to ask you too, why is this kind of study important? You're a scientist, you're a researcher, and we have seen in Elko County that sometimes really important decisions get made based on who was in the room, even if the evidence offered is anecdotal or speculative, right? I shouldn't ask you to agree with that. I'm just...
Yeah, and having not been here until I moved back a year ago, there's a lot that's happened here that I just haven't really kept up with until recently. I think humans tend to be emotional and make decisions based on emotional pleas, frequently more so than based on facts. And so, who's in the room, who's making the most impassioned speech, that's going to carry a lot of weight. That's not necessarily the right answer. That's not necessarily the best answer for any group of people, let alone everybody. And I don't think that any research paper like this needs to make policy, but it can be used to inform policy decisions. If the county commission's debating whether or not we need to go to paper ballots and a hand count, this paper doesn't answer that question, but it gives them some facts that they can use to inform that decision beyond just impassioned speeches by the community.
Thank you, Hank. Do you obviously want to continue doing this kind of work? This did represent a lot of your personal time without being compensated.
I think this work's important to do. It did take a lot of time, and I have businesses to run and things that I need to do. So I'm certainly not volunteering to do this for every election that comes up, but especially because of some of the discourse that was taking place in the community at the time, I think it was important to address this.
Well, we will, before we close the program today, I do want to mention that Dr. Hank Thurston is involved right now with a project involving semiconductors and the Army Research Lab. Is that something that you can talk about?
Yeah, so this grew out of my dissertation research. I defended dual PhDs in physics and computational mathematics in, 2023, spring of 2023 at Michigan State University. And part of that work, I was using semiconducting diamond. So I think everybody's familiar with diamond, that it's, it's really lustrous, pretty gemstone. Everybody knows it's hard. It's used on saw blades and drill bits. What I didn't know, and I don't think a lot of people know until I got into this line of research, is that diamond is essentially the world's best material for everything. So the example I use a lot is, let's say you've got a jet engine. You want to put instrumentation inside of the engine so you can monitor its operation. Excuse me. And we can do that with silicon semiconductors. The problem is because of the temperatures and pressures inside the engine, every time those transistors switch, that signal's just washed out with ripple current. You don't actually get a clean signal from that. Whereas you could replace that with diamond semiconductors. And when that switches, you get a perfectly clear signal. And just that has to do with the physics of how that semiconductor material is different in diamond than silicon. But there's a lot of application there. Currently, that research is held back a lot by the engineering problem of how do we make better diamond. And so a lot of my research group was focused more on how do we develop better techniques for growing diamond more repeatably and more reliably. But my work was more involved in what can we do with it once we have it.
Wow, that sounds like another topic for another show. That's really fascinating, Hank. Thank you for being on the program today. Thanks for doing this research, obviously. And I'm sure that I think it would be nice to give your parents a shout out. I know your dad, obviously your late dad, he long after you graduated from Elko High School, he continued his love of, I think, educating students, and he was involved in speech and debate. And I know your mother is a big influence in your life as well. So, yeah. So thank you. Yeah, thanks to your parents. Well, Scott Gavorsky, you, although being a transplant to Elko, we appreciate your influence in the community as well.
Thank you.
You have a consulting business, and if you wouldn't mind telling us a little bit about that, because you're doing a lot of work behind the scenes.
Oh, yeah. So the consulting business is primarily the initial thing was to help some nonprofits around here with the process of looking at grants and looking at the research they need, which is a factor that's often missing, I think, for rural nonprofits, but also connecting rural and tribal communities throughout the state with these big state-level projects that really see a genesis in some place like Las Vegas or Reno, but really can offer a lot of benefit to rural communities. So, being on the ground out here, building the connections, sort of allows these state programs to have sort of a deeper reach into the rurals for people who might want or need to use them.
Thank you, Scott. Of course, you can find Scott Gavorsky's consultation business because, as he's describing, rural communities have very different needs than urban ones, and so he's specializing in this, obviously, in many different aspects. You can simply go to Gavorsky.com. That's Gavorrsky.com. And then in your other role, if you'd like to give a plug to an event that is coming up in April.
Yes.
You want to do it or you want me to do it?
You guys can share if you want.
Well, I'll start it off. We've got the Lincoln Day dinner coming up on April 12th. It's a wonderful time to come have some camaraderie with friends from the community, have a great dinner catered by Dries this year. Some wonderful auction items, both silent and live.
Yeah, and as always, we've got a nice range of special guests we've invited. So we'll see Representative Mark Amodei, the governor, has said he'll be out there, Controller Andy Matthews, Lieutenant Governor Stavros Anthony. So this is really an opportunity to come out and put a shine on Elko for the state leadership. Tickets are $75 in each. If you'd like, for instance, to get 8 of your friends together and go in on the table, you can buy it for a discounted rate at $5.50, and you can just go over to elkonvgop.org and buy the tickets.
So the big question, do you have to be a registered Republican to go?
Not
They're
enough.
both nodding shaking their heads no vigorously.
No, and the Democrats hold their used to be the Roosevelt Kennedy dinners. We're more than happy to see them there and talk to them, and again, even people who might not be heavily into politics. We regularly invite our tribal communities, and a number of them come up because this is an opportunity for them to talk with people outside the community about their needs as well. And that's the type of conversation we really want to sponsor.
Well, thank you both for being on the program. Hank, did we get to all the topics you were hoping to today? You think we did all right?
I think so.
Okay, appreciate it very much. And Scott, how about for you?
Oh, yeah. I think this went well, and thank you for having us in.
Thank you both, and thank you, listeners, for joining us for Elko Live today. You'll be able to find this program archived at elkoradio.com, and we appreciate you listening today.